Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. So, levelling down HS2 as Boris Johnson cancels the Leeds extension of the rail project. We'll be talking to our chief politics investigations reporter, Sam Bright, about it. Has Boris Johnson let down his red wall voters, or is this a saving for the country from an expensive cash cow?
And is the joke finally wearing thin? Well, we'll be joined in the studio by our Byline Times writer Jonathan Liss and Benjamin Loughnane of the Bow Group think tank to discuss whether the public is now tiring of our zipline riding, gaff-making Prime Minister.
And disinformation, it's everywhere. We do our best to combat it. And a new film is coming out next week, premiered at the Frontline Club with Byline Times, called Disinformed, by the filmmakers Catherine Viken and Dr. Charles Creel, who advised the DCMS committee. Also contributing is Kyle Taylor, our own writer and the author of our little black book of data and democracy. He'll be in the studio with an exclusive clip of the film and to talk to us about disinformation.
But we couldn't do any of this without you. Byline TV really is your TV channel. And so if you do like what we do, please do consider supporting us by heading over to patreon.com/Byline TV, or you could hit the join button on YouTube. And if you do,
you get to join us for a special Q&A session after tonight's show, where you'll be able to ask us all manner of questions and we'll be able to answer a little bit more indiscreetly. Joining us tonight will be Kyle Taylor and Mike Galsworthy, who's talking about Brexit in the programme and will be talking about Brexit in the Q&A. So, our weekly front page, we do a weekly digital front page and a monthly print edition, and our digital front page is VIPs, very influential persons.
Yes, Peter. I mean, it does seem like the mainstream media is now consistently catching up with some of the work that Byline Times has been leading on for more than a year now.
Well, they do say, doesn't it, if a scandal lasts more than 2 weeks in the newspapers, then that's a problem. And it's been 2 weeks of rolling stories, obviously, from the Owen Paterson affair, second jobs for MP, and more about these crony contracts. And we lead on something we have written a lot about, particularly Sam Bright, these VIP lanes, and we lead on the story of Michael Gove being a channel for one of these contracts. So it's great that the mainstream or the legacy or the establishment press are covering this. We're delighted. But you know how long we've been doing this, Hardeep? 20 months. Our first PPE contract story by Nafis Ahmed was in April 2020. So we're delighted. We'd like to move on in some ways, so it's good that other people are taking control in some ways.
And we're never trying to really look for credit. We're just always trying to nudge the mainstream media in the right direction. But it was nice to see our work and Sam Bright's work mentioned in Parliament this week when Labour MP Dawn Butler was talking about these crony contracts and the VIP lane. So it just goes to show that, you know, independent journalism, it can really make a difference and it is really needed. Well,
talking about our brilliant young journalist Sam Bright, he'll be joining us any moment now to talk about HS2 and the cancellation of the Leeds arm. It's now going to stop in Birmingham. So what does that say about Boris Johnson's attitude to levelling up the North? And what does it say about his red wall voters? But is it also a good thing? Because this was an expensive project, and as we'll see, the cost kept on mounting. Now, we'll be speaking to Sam in a moment, but first, let's take a look at what Boris Johnson said about the cancellation of the project, was challenged by Christian Gurumurthy on Channel 4.
And what we're doing is levelling up across the country by giving people in the Midlands and in the North the kind of commuter type services that people have been accustomed to in the Southeast.
You've broken your promises to people here, pledges on Leeds to Manchester. Do you think, you know, you promised Northern Powerhouse Rail between Leeds and Manchester, and you're talking about speed, not capacity. Do you think people in the North are stupid?
You're talking total rubbish, because we're doubling capacity between Manchester and Leeds.
But you're cutting capacity on what it would have been.
We're trebling capacity between Liverpool and Manchester. And of course, Christian, there are going to be people who always want everything at once.
And now we're joined by Sam Bright. Hello, Sam.
Hey up, party.
Hey up.
Hey up.
Indeed. Well, what does this decision this week mean?
Well, there's been quite a significant cut in the amount that's being invested basically to level up the railway system in the North and the Midlands. So it's a cut of anywhere between 14 and 18 billion pounds on a 120 billion pound package that the government promised previously, which has got a lot of people up in arms, particularly because this was a promise that Boris Johnson made to win key seats at the last election, which then tipped his 80-seat majority. So one of the key things is that HS2 won't be winding its way up to Leeds. Instead, there'll be an upgrade to the East Coast Main Line. And there won't be a high-speed rail link between Leeds and Manchester anymore. It seems to be a very fractured system in the north. But still, it has to be said, quite a significant amount of money being invested, £96 billion. And the government says that they'll manage to deliver these improvements a lot more quickly than they would otherwise have been able to, given that HS2 has been such a problematic project in recent years.
Yes, we should talk about that because it's one of the most controversial things we ever write about on Byline Times. On Twitter, whenever we mention HS2, we tend to get a lot of, let's say, very interested and passionate responses. We have covered, by the way, haven't we, Sam, you could explain, we've covered the overspends. Right from the beginning, the misallocation of budgets, or rather the underestimate of the property prices. And then, though people disagree, the extent, but it balloons from about 30 billion to 60 billion, and this Oakervy review estimates it could cost 120 billion.
Yeah, it's spiralling all the time. I think that more conservative estimates have had it inflating from 55 billion to 100 billion in the past 5 years, which I think is quite important to bear in mind where the government's current plans are concerned. So they're pledging to spend, or they were pledging to spend 120 billion, even if we did the eastern leg of HS2. But you've got to take into account value for money. You know, are we getting a 30 billion pound project for 100 billion? In which case, it's not really value for money for the commuters of the north. And I have to say, I travel on the East Coast Main Line a lot to escape London and you two.
Not successfully.
It is an excellent line, and I personally, as a commuter on there, I don't see a great need actually to have HS2 linking up to Leeds. The only problem really is a regional inequality problem in the fact that you've got Manchester connected up to London in less than 2 hours, but you haven't got Leeds connected up to London in less than 2 hours. So you've got potential to have a northern powerhouse just focused in Manchester, where Leeds is a bit marginalised. So on top of having the southeast versus the rest as a regional inequality problem, you might have the northeast versus the northwest as a real site of regional inequality, which wouldn't be good.
So this levelling up is the sort of flagship agenda from this government that we keep hearing about. And we keep having, lofty speeches by the Prime Minister about how every person in the country is going to have an equal level of opportunity regardless of where you live. But various strands of it, of what there is there, seem to be coming sort of away. So what are we left with currently in terms of what we know about the levelling up agenda, the policy? What does that look like?
Like you say, it's very sporadic. Boris Johnson obviously had the shock of the Chesham and Amersham by-election, which switched a blue wall seat from the Conservatives to the Liberal Democrats. And that was an issue that was an election that was driven largely by HS2 going through the constituency, and a lot of Southern voters being unhappy about it. And so he sort of broadened his appeal of the Levelling Up project, which is something that Andy Burnham has noted. So it's not just about the North and the Midlands being levelled up anymore, it's the whole of the country, because he's really worried about him losing and the Conservatives losing those southern seats and not just retaining the red wall. And so you've got some strange policies coming out of government currently. I mean, they're pledging not to invest in housing in the areas of the country where there's the most acute housing problems, because they've got lots of They've got lots of Conservative MPs in the south, southeast and the home counties, where they've got lots of people on the doorstep saying, I don't want any new houses built in my backyard. So they're going to build a lot of new houses up in the north of England as a way of generating growth, allegedly. And then just pouring various pots of money into projects, into pet projects in red wall seats that they won at the last election, which just strikes of political expediency rather than any joined up plan.
And do you think this will be damaging to Johnson? As you said, in terms of the manifesto pledges to the so-called red wall seats, it's all been about levelling up and connectivity. So do you think this is potentially quite damaging, or will it just get lost I'm very much of the opinion, which I find strange that Labour's pushed on this so hard, because Deborah Mattinson, who's the head of strategy at the Labour Party, wrote a book about the red wall, and she noted the fact that lots of red wall voters hate HS2. They think it'll just funnel money into the capital. And so Starmer going hard on, you've cancelled the eastern leg of HS2, I'm not sure will actually sit that well with red wall voters, who would rather see those routes connected between northern towns and cities.
Yes, because that's the big communication about anybody in the north is actually connecting within the cities, not to London, isn't
it? Exactly. They just see, commuters with their briefcases being shuttled back to London, on a weekly basis, and that's not what those traditional red wall voters really want to see.
Well, the expert on this is somebody sitting quite close to us, which is you, because tell us about the book you have coming out, which covers the divides between North and South in this whole agenda.
Yeah, so in April, my book will be published, hopefully. It's called Fortress London, Why We Need to Save the Country from Its Capital. And it's looking at the regional divides in the country through the prism of how London has soared ahead and stood apart from the rest of the nation. And, even in the southwest, there's lots of deprivation. And that's the prism through which we should see the regional imbalances in this country, is that London is the core, the nexus of the problem, and that we need to fix.
Well, that book's coming out, you hope, in April, do you think? What's it? And it's called
Fortress London: Why We Need to Save the Country from Its Capital.
And the publisher?
Harper North.
Who says we don't give book plugs. So thank you, Sam. Come and join us again soon. I'm sure the Byline Times information you gathered will be helpful for your book.
It will.
And well done.
Thank you.
Well done on all your work.
Well done. You
Well
can't
done.
get a better praise than from the editor. Not easy to get. But Brexit, as you might have noticed, we have been covering Brexit in many ways, and one of the most disturbing things we've seen in the last month is the pollution of our rivers and seas. In a moment, we'll be joined by Mike Goldsworthy from the Bylines Network and Scientists for EU to talk about the latest update in that long-running saga of getting Brexit done. But before that, our team, an exclusive preview you'll see of the film they've done, went to see the impact of both pollution and Brexit on the seafood industry in Whitstable.
Someone will die, and that would be on government.
One day someone will die, and it's not our fault.
So we've been doing this for 300 odd years as a family. 8 generations of us Howards have been growing oysters here. The water quality around here historically is fantastic, usually A grade. So you've got grade A, B and C of water quality in this country, and that was part of what we set up through Europe and all that. The quality of that water has dipped recently. The water companies are being called out, but at the end of the day, if one of my oysters makes someone severely ill because of what the water companies are doing, it's not going to be the water companies that get in trouble. It's not the water companies that are going to be shut down. Our business will be shut down. So I think Brexit has been the main cause for most of the problems that we're facing at the moment in this country. It is because of Brexit that water companies have been given, that leash has been taken off them. They're not being held to account by Europe anymore. So they just go, well, we'll do what we want. And it appears that government are almost by omission supporting them. They will be responsible for decimating whole communities, whole economies, if they don't get a grip on things like raw sewage. Doesn't seem like they really care. And so when it comes to these wonderful things that have been keeping my family in business for 300 years, they don't really care. And that's it. That's quite simple. I feel for the guys in Whitstable with the talks of people getting ill from eating their oysters. The thing is, it's once that happens, it's really hard to come back from it. Like as an oyster grower, if you get one thing happen where it's alleged that you've made someone ill, that can be really damaging, and that can really hurt your business, because people go, oh, well, I heard about Whitstable oysters. Yeah, they're not very good. They make you ill. I'm not going there anymore. And the knock-on effect of wiping you out can actually be really fast. It could actually just wipe out coastal communities in one foul sweep. And I don't think our government fully comprehend the long-reaching consequences of what they're allowing water companies to do.
Well, we're delighted to welcome Mike Galsworthy, founder of A Scientist for EU and a co-founder of our Bylines networks. Welcome, Mike. Before we get on to the wider issues of the Northern Ireland Protocol and Article 16, which we'll have to explain to people, I think, just could you take us through the way that the pollution crisis we've covered now for a month in our rivers and seas is related to Brexit in a couple of ways?
Okay, so there are two aspects to this. Firstly, during the referendum debate, a lot of people were quick to highlight that one of the benefits we had from going into the European Union was that we signed up to agreements about cleanliness, water cleanliness, beach cleanliness, air cleanliness, and throughout our membership of the European Union, our government and some of our companies butted up several times against the European Court of Justice. Remember that evil European Court of Justice that was actually enforcing us to keep to standards that we had agreed in terms of dumping sewage on beaches or polluting the air.
And it's completely separate from the European Court of Human Rights, and the two were constantly conflated, weren't they?
Yes. So the European Court of Justice is the final arbitrator of agreements made within the single market. And so there was a fear that should we leave the EU and roll back on standards, even when the public, the British public, have complaints about slipping standards in air quality or water quality, who do we go to? Because in the EU, you can go to the European Court of Justice and say, look, it's a breach of contract, and they have the authority to hit down on it. So that's one thing where there's continuing fear about, like, who was going to keep us in line now, according to what we agree. But the other thing was, of course, when we had the supply chain issues caused by Brexit, it was actually flagged up quite early on by our own Bylines network. Sussex Bylines actually did a series about threats to water pollution coming up because the supply of chemicals needed to treat water. So when that started becoming an issue, our government told the water companies, you know what, dump it in the rivers. You know, you can do that once in a while. Do that now to get round the problem. But then it started coming up on mainstream media radar that actually, and it came up in the Parliament, what's going on here? How come there is more sewage dumping suddenly happening? And it's because of Brexit that we can't run systems like we could. So we're just dumping things on the beaches, dumping things in rivers. Oh, and by the way, we don't subscribe to any authorities anymore to keep ourselves properly on track. So those are the two different angles whereby this is Brexit related.
And it's having a major impact. I mean, we've had several films on this, people saying, you know, this is the worst pollution they've seen in years.
Yep.
It's not getting any better. And that's a double whammy of regulation and supply chain problems.
Yeah, so Kaylin of Byline TV has gone off, I know, to Yorkshire, where there was a swimmer who liked swimming in rivers, who's like, what is this? This is disgusting. But then there was also in the east of England a kayaker.
Yes.
And she's originally from somewhere in Africa, I believe.
Zimbabwe, yeah.
Yeah, and she was saying, I came to the UK thinking, like, it's a clean country, you know, nice squeaky clean England, and now I'm kayaking past all these outlets of sewage and nappies and stuff flowing into the rivers. What are you doing?
Yeah. So talking about pollution let's talk about the pollution of the public domain. One thing I've noticed in the culture wars that have been played out in the last year, maybe distract us from sort of PPE contracts or things like that, is Europe the bad guy. The French with their fish, and then so Lord Frost, our chief EU negotiator, has been playing a kind of Russian roulette game with the EU about the Northern Ireland Protocol. That is the protocol which sort of looks after, doesn't it, the fact that because there can't be a hard border due to the Good Friday Agreement, the regulations in Northern Ireland between that and the Republic cannot be the same as with the UK. Now, for the last year, it seems to be, they've been threatening to pull the trigger on this Article 16. Explain what that is about and why, at least as far as I can see, they seem to be backing off this threat of shooting themselves in the foot.
Right. Okay. So the whole purpose of the protocol was essentially, if you're going to take the UK out of the single market, then there is a tear, there's a break between the UK market and the wider European market. And it's like tearing a piece of paper. Where's that tear line going to go? Right. There's only two places where it can realistically go, unless you take all of Ireland out with the UK, and that is along the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, or along the border between Britain and Northern Ireland.
Irish Sea, effectively.
Yeah, so down the Irish Sea, and it has to be one of those two in order to have the separation boundary between the two markets. Now, to put it along the Northern Irish border, which goes back and forth and back and forth, and is also associated with where there were all these checks and tensions before, would just set up physical targets that people feared would kick off the troubles. So it was a case of putting it in the Irish Sea. As you have to put it somewhere, put it here.
By the way, just say that it would also be in breach, I believe, of the Good Friday Agreement, which is a internationally ratified treaty with the Americans signatory to put border checks there.
Yes.
And this only arose, people, because we decided extreme kind of Brexit. Have we had a customs union? There were other ways that we could have left the EU and not had this tear.
Exactly. So Theresa May's solution had been to think about how you can do this in terms of a pseudo-customs union that allows extra freedoms, and that was quite unworkable. And there were a bunch of technological solutions touted for how you could do it along the Irish border, but with remote tracking so that you didn't actually need infrastructure on the ground and in the sea. But that was fantasy thinking because no one does that anywhere else in the world, and we hadn't even tested a sample along a border of how you could do it. So at the end of the day, because time ran out, it was just Boris Johnson agreed to down the Irish Sea. But that means that there's going to be checks, and because there were checks, and we agreed to this, that meant that the flow of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland was interrupted, and also those businesses in Northern Ireland realised, well, actually, we're still part of the single market, so we can get a lot of effortless trade there. This has spooked the likes of David Frost and Boris Johnson because they don't like trade diversion, and there's a big issue of kind of like, does this mean that the protocol has failed? Because if there's too much trade diversion, you can say, whoa, I want to pull the plug on this a bit.
And the plug is Article 16.
And the plug is Article 16 because there are provisions within the protocol that say if it starts going awry on some of the following factors, one is too much trade diversion, others is, destabilisation of communities and so forth and so on, then we can sort of, both at the EU end and also at the UK end, fiddle with the rules a bit in order to make things work. So it's actually quite a flexible set of provisions. But you sure as hell want to do it by agreement because Northern Ireland is so sensitive on that front. So what has happened is, because there was a threat of that and because there was some trade diversion seen, the EU said, you know what, we were actually quite hard-arsed about this at the beginning. Here's a whole raft of sweeping changes that we're going to make in order to really, really loosen up the border. And it really caught, apparently, David Frost and others by surprise. They weren't expecting that the EU was going to move from there to just say, you know what, we'll get rid of this and that and all the rest. And they didn't know whether to champion it as a sort of triumph, like some of the media did, or think that they were being played on it. The way that David Frost has played it is to kind of like, wow, I wasn't expecting that, but I'm going to stick to my line anyway. And his line includes, we want to tear up aspects of the original agreement because the European Court of Justice should have no jurisdiction here. I know we signed that it would do because it's part of the single market, but now we've decided it can't.
But we know Lord Frost, God bless him, makes lots of these loud statements, and a lot of them are parlayed to the press as part of this kind of, they're the bogeymen, the bad guys. But he seems to have backed down, so what I'm hearing is that
he hasn't backed down.
But we're not going to get an Article 16 launched before Christmas. This is what I'm reading. They say it was a crazy thing to do.
So he's saying he's
retaliate.
not. So his saying is not back down at all. He's saying that his tone has become nicer, and he hasn't been so belligerent in the press. And I think part of it is because the Conservative Party have been really spooked by their own corruption scandals. And so many Tory MPs know their constituents don't care about Northern Ireland. So the last thing that their constituents want to see is sleaze, broken promises on HS2. Oh, and by the way, we've got trade wars with all of our neighbours, France and Ireland and the lot. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Well, you've given me the perfect link to our next section, Mike.
Yep.
Which is about Boris Johnson and Tory sleaze and whether this is catching up with him in the polls. But thanks for joining us, and come back and keep us updated. Mike will stay with us, not at the moment. He'll be coming back for a Q&A after the show.
Can I say just one more thing quickly?
Very quick.
Because as a scientist, one of the things that's kept hanging, because Article 16 or the protocol hasn't been resolved, is actually our membership of the EU science programme. And that is worth many billions to us and a lot of leadership on that. So that's one thing that I personally feeling very spooked about.
Well, this is very important. If people want to know more about that, they can ask Mike in the Q&A section after the show. You just sign up on Patreon or on YouTube. And for those who have already about the Q&A programme after the show. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for making that point. But back to Boris Johnson, Hardy.
Yes, so over the past week, the polls have put Labour and Conservative neck and neck, and some polls have even put Labour out in front, especially on the issue of who people would prefer as a better Prime Minister. So, in some respects, is the game up finally for Boris Johnson. He's mired in controversy, facing various claims and allegations of corruption, and seems to constantly misread the mood of the country. Well, in a moment, we'll be joined by Jonathan Liss and Benjamin Loughnane to discuss whether the public is finally tiring of the Prime Minister. But first of all, let's take a quick look at a clip from this week's PMQs in the House of Commons, where Boris Johnson was once again turning to banter and jokes when he was referencing a second job in relation to the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer.
Many members opposite have apologised. The Business Secretary has apologised for his part. The Leader of the House has apologised for his part. But they were following the Prime Minister's lead. So will he do the decent thing and just say sorry for trying to give the green light to corruption?
Well, yes, as I've said before, it certainly was a mistake to conflate the case of an individual member, no matter how sad, with the point of principle at stake. And we do need a cross-party approach on an appeals process. In the meantime, perhaps he could clear up from his proposals whether he would continue to be able to take money as he did from Mishcon Dorea and other legal firms.
That's not an apology. Everybody else has apologised for him, but he won't apologise for himself. A coward, not a leader. We still haven't shut the door on the revolving door where ministers are regulating a company 1 minute and working for them the next. There are plenty of cases that still stain this House. There are 2 simple steps to sorting it out: proper independence and powers for the Business Appointments Committee and banning these job swaps. Will the Prime Minister take those steps?
Everybody can see, Mr. Speaker, is it in a classic lawyerly way. The right honourable gentleman is now trying to prosecute others for exactly the course of action that he took himself.
Prime Minister, I don't want to fall out about it. I've made it very clear. It is Prime Minister's questions. It's not to the opposition to answer your question. Whether we like or not, those are the rules of the game that we're all into, and we play by the rules, don't we? And we respect this House, so let's respect the House. Keir Starmer.
So, quite a lively session of PMQs we saw this week. We're now joined in the studio by our Byline Times writer Jonathan Liss and also Benjamin Loughnane of the Bow Group think tank. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Jonathan, let's start with yourself. I mean, there are by now some sort of cliche commentaries on Boris Johnson's popularity. You know, the fact that enough of the public seem to like his Latin, his jokes and his messed up hair, and in some ways in his sort of lies and his self-denial see someone quite human reflected back at them. But are we getting a sense now, with all the controversies and the constant stories about corruption, that actually people are starting to see through this now and they're not finding any of it funny?
Yeah, I suppose if you talk to pollsters, they say that actually Johnson has never been as popular as people think, and it's almost like gets to be this idea that we kind of like we're following each other into this particular narrative that he's always been incredibly popular. We forget that in 2019, immediately after he became Prime Minister, he was booed everywhere he went. And it was only when that kind of got parcelled up into the election, getting Brexit done, and then obviously that happened, Corbyn was less popular than he was, and then afterwards COVID, where even though people like us were criticising the government on a regular basis, the public by and large gave him and the government the benefit of the doubt. And obviously when he went into hospital, that was the peak of his popularity. And so he's had a lot of luck, obviously not being in hospital, but he's been a very, very lucky Prime Minister domestically, that things have gone his way. And even things that would have felled other lesser mortals, if you like, he's managed to ride through, partly through luck, partly through his whole political shtick, which is just to ride things out, is the total shamelessness we all know about, and that which was, as we know, was priced in. I suppose that comes back to a question about being about the joke, and I think there's a really interesting idea here about it's not just that people enjoy the joke, but it was as though people were in on the joke. Yes. Is that there was this very much this element of Johnson's shtick where he kind of, there was an interview with a conference with Tom Newton-Dunn of Times Radio, when Newton-Dunn was rightly asking him about the slaughter of pigs, and Johnson was pretending, I can only assume it was pretending, not to know what he meant. He was saying, well, Tom, pigs get slaughtered, i.e. how stupid are you? How do you think pigs get onto your dinner plates? Whereas obviously the story was and is that it was pigs being slaughtered who weren't going to end up on dinner plates because there weren't enough butchers and abattoir workers to process them so they could become pork and bacon. And Johnson did this comedy routine where he was looking to the camera and saying, isn't this guy a moron? And where obviously there was an outrageous story because this was because of Brexit. Farmers were up in arms about, and the National Farmers Union was saying it was a catastrophe for farmers, and Johnson was just kind of playing the joker, having a big laugh about it. And I think that is the thing that where we moved from being in on the joke to actually being the joke ourselves. That's the fundamental point, I think, and that's the Rubicon that we've now crossed.
Do you find it striking that, as you were saying, there are a number of people and in the media who raise concerns about the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis, in which more than 140,000 people have died in this country, and yet that doesn't seem to have touched the Prime Minister in the same way as these more recent scandals with regards to corruption and second jobs. And do you think that is having traction and it is sort of the beginning of the end for him now?
Yeah, and it was interesting, I was speaking to some Tories recently, and they were pointing out that Prime Ministers always go on much longer than you think. So, Theresa May was finished in sort of June 2017, if you like, after the 2017 election, but she kind of staggered on for 2 torturous years after that. And I think, I wrote an article last November, actually, for Prospect, saying that Johnson could be out quite quickly. And the funny thing is, I wasn't actually wrong, because all the things all the seeds that I laid at that time that people were laying at that time are still current. Brexit is, long-running drama, which will eventually catch up with him, is catching up with him. COVID, likewise, even though it hasn't so far, because there's only so much which the public is prepared to give the benefit of the doubt for, and only so long they'll do that for. And so all the seeds are there, but they might just take a very, very long time to come to fruition. And as we know, sometimes it's things that you're not expecting, things that come out of left field, which actually prove the catalyst. So wallpaper, we thought might be it, and it still might be because that's not finished yet. And obviously, the sleeves thing, a complete own goal of Johnson's, which has been running for 2.5 weeks now and has shown no sign of abating, even though we had a poll today where the Conservatives were back on top of it a little bit. But I don't think that's over. Who knows? Everything's unpredictable.
I mean, all these old scandals may resurface, and there's a new lens to look at them.
And there's accumulation, there's a snowball effect and all of this stuff. So I think that the seeds are laid. I just don't know how long it'll take.
Benjamin, what's your take? Do you think it's obvious that Boris Johnson is now losing popularity and the Conservatives, his own party, are onto this, or do you think that he'll hang on a while longer?
Well, I think what will happen is it comes down to the polling. The moment MPs start to see that they are at threat of losing their own seats, then they will start to turn on him because, certainly in the Red Wall, for example, Red Wall seats, Red Wall MPs, they are often on very small majorities. They've only won those seats back from very big Labour majorities in the last election. It's not too difficult to see that people who lent their vote over Brexit or over whatever else, over Corbyn perhaps, or whatever they disagreed with, will, now that those aren't the issues that are present, they're not the issues that they care about anymore, they might flip back to Labour. So there are a lot of people in the Red Wall, I think, who will at some point think, this guy is a massive embarrassment and he's going to lose me my seat. He's still going to have his seat. He's still going to be, Prime Minister unless we do something about it.
And what do you make of this, almost double-edged sword discussions about his personality in particular? I mean, do you think that is to some extent, his kind of character traits are over-egged, and it's much more pragmatic within the party about what they're using him for as an electoral vehicle, or do you think it's?
I'm not sure. I think he's probably
something different.
I think he's a worse Prime Minister than Theresa May, but he's got a better personality in the sense that he can play off a lot of his worse failures through dismissive wit and charm and all the rest of it, whereas Theresa May was always quite awkward, quite sort of, stiff and wooden, and even if she did something that wasn't necessarily that bad, it could be made into a huge scandal because she didn't have the ability to play it off.
And she was a woman.
Indeed, and many other things. There are many factors to it, but I think for Boris, he's got that sort of bombastic, sort of character, which means that he can sort of make you forget a lot of his flaws. It covers a multitude of sins.
Well, before we talk about this further, let's go to a clip from Newsnight last night, actually 2 nights ago, where Nick Watt reported from the 1922 committee, a very influential committee in the Conservative Party, and grumblings of discontent from them.
Tonight, he addressed what was described to me as a very grim meeting of the 1922 committee. That's the backbench committee of MPs. Now, one grandee said to me it was awful. This person said that the Prime Minister kept on saying he's got Brexit done. And this grandee, who's a Brexiteer, sort of rolled his eyes saying, we've heard that one before. This is what this very senior MP said of Boris Johnson's premiership. He said, this is not working. He's like an old rock star in need of new material. So it was another troubled day in the premiership.
So Benjamin, it's great to have you here. We love having Conservative commentators. And one of the things that most amazes me as somebody now who is 60, who remembers Margaret Thatcher, she was the daughter famously of a grocer from Grantham. She believed in Samuel Smiles, self-help, Adam Smith, Friedrich Hayek. It was all about government not choosing winners, about there being a really open, free market. How does that fit in with a government, at least according to Byline Times reporting, and obviously now mainstream reporting on these second jobs, is giving contracts without competition, 3 billion of them to Tory donors and supporters. There seems to be amping up second jobs for MPs who seem to be appointing their buddies in all kinds of places in public life. Is this a betrayal of Thatcherism?
I think that Thatcher, that era in politics, was a lot more ideological. It was much more focused on ideas rather than what it currently is now, which is power. It's a power game. The only ideology that the Conservative Party holds now is maintaining power. And whatever they need to believe in order to maintain power, they will believe in. So 10 years ago, they were not Eurosceptic. They did not believe in leaving the European Union. Then the power shifted. They saw that's what would keep them in power, is taking that hard sort of polemical tone on Brexit. And
cultural, anti-free trade. It wasn't a free trade.
And everything. There's all sorts of things. And everything ideologically that they believe in isn't because they believe in it, like Thatcher. It's because they believe that it will give them power. And the only thing they believe in is power.
But power is brought with good donors, financing, data operations, campaign money on Facebook. And one of the ways they seem to be doing that, at least a lot of our coverage, is courting oligarchs. I mean, one of our theories is we're moving away from a kind of free market economy, part of it imported from Russia, but other oligarchies as well, of oligarchical capture of the state. So the state, oligarchs get in, get the contracts. Do you not see that even if it's unconscious, there is a political process like that actually happening below the surface?
Absolutely. And you look at companies like Serco, for example, which operate, they are proper crony capitalists in the sense of there's no free enterprise, there's no bidding on those contracts. Those contracts are public money, taxpayer money, which goes to this huge glutted private company full of Tory sort of, cronies, and then that privatizes into profit. So it goes from the state socialised, money into profit with no competitive process in between whatsoever. That's not the free market. That is a horrible hybrid of socialism, capitalism, and the absolute worst parts of both.
I'm sure Serco would say they've done nothing wrong and they're just following what any good company would do. But also we see the other thing, that this helps the Conservative Party because these companies, and we've tracked several, 6 or 7, then increase their donations to the Conservative Party. And do you think that is, let's open this up to Jonathan too. Is there really something sick in the system which is allowing this? Partly the donation system, lack of funding for parties, the way the MPs see them as second jobs, the ways they see being an MP is chicken feed compared to the salary Boris Johnson got at the Telegraph or Owen Paterson got from his lobbying activities. Is there something wrong with the system?
Yeah. Well, I think we have a profoundly sick political culture. And it's a profoundly corrupt political culture, as we're seeing. And there are many reasons for that, partly because we have a culture where millions of votes are effectively disenfranchised, and so each election just comes down to a handful of marginal seats where those MPs really have to work hard for the vote, and everyone else, people like Geoffrey Cox don't stand any chance of getting voted out in West Devon. And so I think that's part of the story, but not the whole story. I think we just get very, very complacent in this country. We think we're better than other people, that things that happen in other countries, faraway countries, can't possibly happen here because we play by the rules. If we've learned anything for the last 5 years, and longer in fact, is that people don't play by the rules. And if you play by the rules, other people come and they'll take the advantage by not doing that. And so gentlemen's agreements need gentlemen. We don't have a lot of those anymore.
And so we need laws instead, and Hardy writes a lot about this, before the Times did last week, an essay 5 months ago.
Good chaps have left the room. Britain, it's time to wake up.
But this is an interesting moment, therefore, because, we'd say the Bow group's on the right, I'd say you're on the left, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
Could a consensus be built across party, to change these rules, to make a fair play, to change donations, to make sure that the rule of law isn't just bent?
I think there's too much emphasis on sort of wings in politics, left and right. I think there are certain people as well. There are people who are fundamentally good and care about things like not having corruption in politics and actually having democracy, and people, being able to affect change through discussion and debate and voting, rather than through a few people funding big think tanks to produce certain kinds of reports, and then that becomes government policy with absolutely no review whatsoever from the people. I think that we probably agree on a lot more in that regard, quite aside from the ideology. The details about what we actually believe in terms of ideology, we can put to the side, because the bigger fight is actually the corruption. Because
and the rules of the game whereby we engage in
because neither one of us are going to win at the end of the day while the game is staggered against us.
Well, brilliant. Well, it's so great to have you both here, and you must both come back, and separately and together. There is a question, but maybe leave it to another time because it's too far in the future. Is there anybody to replace Boris Johnson? Maybe a quick answer from you both. That's the question, is that if you're famously the Conservative Party is a conspiracy to win power, which it was called in the 19th century, it's maybe become more so again now. Is there anybody who could step up next year and replace Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party?
Well, if I can jump in on that, I'd just say the selection process is so corrupt at the moment. It's one of the areas of corruption I'm talking about, that in order to become a member of Parliament, to be in a position where you can become the leader, you have to be already compromised to a certain degree. There are very few MPs I can think of who I would say have avoided that, and a lot of them tend to be from an older generation. In recent years, CCHQ has become so fundamentally corrupt that I don't see anyone really honest and well-intentioned being able to become an MP without sort of selling out at some point.
But a bigger question really, could anybody replace him as PM? Do you see anybody who's in the... I could do what Boris did to Theresa May. I know she staggered on for 2 years, but is anybody before the next election?
Well, I know that there are arguments about whether he'll survive David Gortberg's piece today, saying he thinks that Johnson will probably survive to the next election. I think that things, as we know, gradually, then suddenly, if his position looks untenable, then the Conservatives didn't get to where they are through generosity. They'll get rid of him, and then I'm sure that if the ball were to free itself from the scrum, as Johnson himself said once, Sunak or Truss would be there, or maybe Patel as well, to try and get it themselves.
Truss is the most popular, I think. Patel is Patel is unpopular, and so maybe it falls to Sunak.
I think she's quite popular with some of the grassroots, though, but she might have lost her copybook with the whole refugee thing. The Truss is very popular. I think Sunak's probably quite popular
I think Patel is perceived as being not particularly competent as part of the issue.
Well, if that was an issue, then we wouldn't have a current Prime Minister. So.
On that note,
I couldn't agree more.
Brilliant. Thank you both for joining us, and come back and say we can't stay for Q&A, but next time probably you can. So, disinformation is one of the problems we're always confronting on Byline Times, and one of the reasons maybe we're in the political situation we are, particularly with social media outfits like Facebook, dark money and dirty data. In a moment we'll be joined by Carl Taylor, author of Byline Books, Little Black Book of Data and Democracy, and a contributor to a major new film which is being released in a special premiere for us at Byline Times Frontline Club on Wednesday. And you can get virtual tickets to that, will be on sale on Monday. But before Carl joins us, let's take a quick look at this film made by Dr. Charles Creel and Karen, I always forget it, Viken. And he will be joining us. He's also a contributor to explain more about the areas that Disinformed explores and why it's so important for our democracy.
We had a global pandemic happening at the same time as a racial justice pandemic, happening at the same time as an economic disruption. What ended up happening was it was the perfect storm.
This Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education meeting was adjourned after a ruckus crowd refused to put on masks.
Science is not fact. There is no pandemic amongst children.
One of the things that struck me is that QAnon was appealing to women in the exact same way that ISIS had appealed to young women, which is, did you want to help the children?
A number of women have been particularly active in the QAnon movement. In most extremist groups, it's usually less than 5% of members or participants are females.
If you had any kind of sense and you're vegan and you're into holistic nutrition, you would know that this whole thing is one big hoax.
So our kids have never been vaccinated. They've never had antibiotics.
The QAnon photos, overwhelmingly white children, battered and bruised, because they understood their audience were the yoga moms. Because they understood their audience were the yoga moms.
Man hører om travle sykehus, men det stemmer ikke med personlig research.
If I'm buying conspiracy, then who's doing the selling?
Put down 8 fingers if you're not getting the vaccine.
Are germs real? What are viruses? Can they kill a person?
I do not believe in pathogenic microbes.
I don't know how many of you are going to Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'm here to introduce a film called Medical Racism.
The persuasive tactics are really engaging. They are charismatic people, who know what they're doing.
If that's where we are, then you do wonder, can we come back from that?
Well, it's been a packed show, but last but not least, we are now joined by our Byline Times writer, Kyle Taylor, who is also the author of the Little Black Book of Data and Democracy, published by Byline Books. Kyle, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So this documentary, Disinformed, you're a contributor. What was the thinking behind this film and why now?
Yeah, so it's co-directed by Charles and Kath. Charles is the special advisor to the online safety bills, pre-legislative scrutiny committee. Kath, they also put together a film called People You May Know, which was about the evangelical Christian movement and the Republicans in the United States. And they were really looking for like what's cusping in the disinformation space. And they found it. It is this intersection between QAnon and the wellness world.
Yeah.
And it's sort of where far left, far right come back together into this space, and they've done a brilliant job of globalizing it as well. There are stories from the United States, there are stories from the UK, there are stories from Europe, but you know, how do you end up in this place where yoga moms are anti-vaxxers and leading QAnon?
And this is through particularly during the coronavirus, this alliance. We have written about it on Byline Times, the woo-woo world and being the source of the anti-vaxxer movement and then moving to QAnon. Is that because that was the opportunistic space during the coronavirus, that people concerned about health and the state intervening? Because there's a kind of libertarian theme, isn't there, across the wellness world to QAnon, that governments are bad, don't let them vaccinate you, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and it's about distrust, right? And the thing about conspiracies and disinformation is there's always a kernel of truth, right? And what we see in this film are heartbreaking stories of women who have had bad experiences with what you might call the medical establishment, and who as a result become increasingly susceptible to the idea that the establishment as a whole is broken, and therefore it cannot be trusted with their baby, their whatever, whether it's anti-vax or, as this film gets into, this new emerging thing called wild birthing, right? Where people women are finding out they're pregnant and then completely eliminating the medical establishment from every stage of their pregnancy. No scans, no prenatal vitamins, no doctor's visits, nothing. And then when they find out, when their water breaks, they then have the baby with no medical interventions, which is extremely, extremely worrying, right, for both the mother and for the baby.
The child mortality must be soaring in cases like that.
And that's the thing. I mean, this is the cusp of disinformation. This is like where we're looking to see what happens next. That's how new this is, and people are profiting from this. So people are saying that they're wild birthing experts, right? Subscribe to my program, my wild birthing program. Pay monthly, and I'll help you through the wild birthing program. Shun modern medicine, shun pharmaceuticals, shun vaccinations, you know? And as the doctor said to me, so I got my booster shot yesterday, and the doctor was saying to me, lamenting that her own father was an anti-vaxxer. And I said, what do you think is the problem? And she said, it's the internet. The internet. It's absolutely the internet.
In which case, what is the solution? I mean, if you've got people who are thinking, well, I'm pregnant, but I don't want to be involved in any way in a health service or a hospital, I'm going to have the baby by myself, and developing these beliefs which are so ingrained and, you know, are then very tightly held onto, how are those people going to be reached in order to help them see that this is not in their best interest or their child's best interest?
Reaching them is the ultimate challenge, right? And I think we have to look at this from a systems perspective for the future, while also mitigating for the current situation. So, you know, there's great legislation coming in the UK and in the EU that is going to make sure that, you know, people still have the right to free speech, but we mitigate the harms of freedom of reach. Because this is how these people get pulled in. I mean, we just saw, just as a final example, you know, we saw through the Facebook files and the Facebook papers, Facebook themselves were creating false accounts to see what happens. They created an account in the United States that only followed Fox News. That was the only account. And within 48 hours, they were being recommended to QAnon groups. Right? So we know the architecture is broken. We know this is a systems problem. And we cannot expect people who are stuck in their homes for years through COVID to be able to themselves unpick these things. That's not how social media works. And as this doctor said to me, social media is like a religion. People seem to believe and have faith in information they see online the way that they do at church or in a synagogue or
Well, no, I was going to say the difference is you're personally being shared this information with another person. Somebody you find. It's not the New York Times. And that is evangelical, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so, but that's my final question is it financial drive of these people making money out of crack cures or whatever, the financial algorithms of YouTube as well can do this as well as Facebook? Or is there an ideology behind it? Is there a plan? I mean, there are sort of rumours of various political influences around QAnon and connections to the wellness community. Do you think this is a kind of socially emergent phenomenon, or is there a kind of some weird rationale behind it?
Well, the ideology is going to exist, right? It's going to exist. The simple question is there an outlet through which they can profit and grow without any sort of controls? And the other thing this film goes into is the disinformation dozen, right? Which we're talking 12 people, 2/3 of all COVID disinfo. So it is profitable because it drives engagement. The company's making money, the advertiser is making money, so why would you stop it? And that's the crux of it. So, you have a nugget, you want to believe something, and then there's this whole system, your entire digital world is working. It's a machine that's driving the things we don't want to drive in a society. So it's a bit of both, but this is where governments have to step in. This is where we have to say no business is bigger than a democratic society, right? It's our country, our rules, and work under them, because at this point we're genuinely talking about matters of life or death.
And there's this, 100 years ago we talk about pollution, the polluter pays in when it comes to industries or utilities. And maybe it's time for them to do. Sorry, Hardeep, you wanted to add?
No, unfortunately, we're nearly out of time. So I'm just going to ask Kyle, where can people see Disinformed?
The film.
Yes.
So the film is premiering. It's UK premiere. We'll have the directors here in London next Wednesday night. Byline is co-hosting the premiere. There's going to be a live stream option for people not in London, and they'll be able to both watch the film and tune into the panel. The panel afterwards is Damian Collins, MP, Ian Lucas, former MP.
He's writing a book for us?
Yeah, he's writing a book for us as well. I'm on the panel and the directors, and it's chaired by Mariana Spring, who's the BBC's first disinformation reporter. So it's going to be a fantastic panel, and it's genuinely a fantastic film. Like, it is mind-blowing.
So this is highly recommended. You can see we could carry on talking about this all night, but we will carry on talking about it on Wednesday night, and we'll be having details of how you can join remotely, and there are tickets on sale. Just on one thing on wild birthing, it turned out my granddaughter was born accidentally through wild birthing into the hands of my son before the paramedics arrived. So there is some good news to be had. In the meantime, join us on Wednesday. That starts at 8, does it? Is it 7?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock, but check our feeds. We'll be mailing out about it. And of course, we'll be here next week. And if you want to hear a bit more from Carl, you don't have to wait till Wednesday. Sign up on Patreon, patreon.com/Byline TV or the YouTube, and ask him and Mike Galsworthy questions in about 15 minutes. But meanwhile, see you next week, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.